In today's episode of the social media program, we're talking about newsletters. Are they value or not? My perspective is very warped on newsletters, and I'm going to share a little bit more about that because we don't have a newsletter with the Crochet Crowd, and I'll tell you why. So back in the olden days, we had a newsletter that was going to help us, and we were told initially when I started this whole journey that unless you have a newsletter list, you are not a valued person. So I signed up for a newsletter and I used Constant Contact actually to begin. And it got to the point where the newsletter itself was not affordable as a small company to be able to run. So I think I was running about $1,300 in monthly expenses just to have a newsletter. And people would say, oh, I wish you would do this and I wish you would do this. And I'm like, yeah, I can do that, but I can't afford to run the newsletter. So any kind of emailing list is never usually free. It always comes with a service fee to a company. To save money, we changed out our newsletter and we went to Malagen, based out of Europe, and what a effing disaster that was. And I learned in perspective later on, and I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, is that this particular host was literally being blocked by servers across the globe. So our stuff just could not even get out. So I would even have myself in the mailing list and I would send out the email and nothing would show up. And so it was months and months and months. And we end up ruining our newsletter list as a result. So after months of that, we switched over to MailChimp, and MailChimp is actually not a bad service. We just decided at the end of the whole Malagen experience, that company out of Europe, is that I think we were just spinning our gears and wasting money on a newsletter. So what was happening with that is that certain companies can actually block a server from being able to deliver. An example of this is that I was actually co-working with another company where they were sending out newsletters and they were telling me that certain servers actually block IP addresses from certain mailing platforms that do that. So for example, maybe a little 2-bit little internet company out in the middle of nowhere has the ability to turn off the email notifications of a service that is coming in that keeps inundating the customers with emails. And so they identified that this service, because people push spam, this service has the ability to turn off the notifications and actually just send the email into God knows where, and it never ever gets to the person at the end of the day. But you as a creator are paying for that list of people to send out the email to. So what they have is that they have a deliverable rate. And so the deliverable rate for us was about 23%. So 23% of the mailing list would actually open their newsletter. But as the years marched on, it went down to 13%. So it would get lower and lower and lower. And that's because more companies were getting onto newsletters. And if you look at your email list today, how many newsletters that you get from different companies, some people send them ridiculously one a day. And so you feel like you're just being constantly jumped on by the same company over and over and over. And for that, people start losing trust in the newsletters because they are just being inundated with those. So newsletters take time. Do you have time to run a newsletter? And that's to make all the content for it. So usually a newsletter, the goal is that the newsletter is referring to already existing content. So for example, you would have to write it up in a blog with social media posts and then have the newsletter point to it. So you're just doubling up on the work in order to do that. So in 2017, we decided to end our newsletter, and also a Canadian law came into effect. It's called CASL, CASL, and it is the legislation that prevents companies like mine, being Canadian, from adding anybody to an emailing list without their consent. So what was happening for me is that people were not being able to sign themselves up, and they say, can you please sign up my email address? Here's my email and put me on your list. Well, as a Canadian company, we're not legally allowed to do that. So it became a point where the Canadian law said, you need to verify that everybody on your mailing list, and we had like 130,000 people on the mailing list. And because the law went down, we never had the tracking consent of these people that had went into the mailing list. So example with something like this would be like a Crochet Cruises, where we would add people to the mailing list for the Crochet Cruise. Those kind of stuff, because it was a manual entry, then becomes illegal. So there are many laws, depending on where you live, that impact something like this. But for myself, I thought, you know what, the social media does the push notifications, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, all the rest of them. And I thought, well, why am I spending money on a newsletter when literally the social media platforms are doing that? You will find some people saying, I really hate Facebook. Send me a newsletter because I refuse to be part of Facebook. You know, if they don't want to be part of Facebook, that's on them. Let them have their own decision, because that is their own decision to make that. Just because you switch to a newsletter doesn't mean that same person is even going to open your email. So by trying to accommodate people that threaten you, saying, well, if you're not going to use a newsletter, I'm just not going to be part of it, just let them be. You can't do everything. You're a creator like me. You cannot be in all spaces 100% of the time. For example, most of my day I'm spending on YouTube. It is my most joyous experience of the platform, of them all. I love to teach. I love to be part of that community. And so I'm not on the other social media platforms as much as I am on YouTube. So you have to find where you find your joy, but also what is going to serve you the most as far as being able to reach out, to give your message out to other people, regardless on the topic. So when you're spending money on newsletters, you may actually just be sending your money into the garbage, but you have to determine what you're willing to do. And you got to make sure that if you are doing a newsletter, you look at the return traffic from your newsletter and determine, is the price that you just paid for that newsletter offsetted by the amount of work that you put into that in order to make that happen? And what are you willing to settle for when it comes to the return rate? So make sure that you're paying attention to your metrics, as we've talked about in a previous episode.